All right. So at this point, I'm now going in and just refining the termination point, because with the mesh as it was for our turntable, there were still a lot of things that had edges that I hadn't terminated. I hadn't solved the puzzle yet, or areas where, I still had long faces that need to be made more square. And I still hadn't figured out how to terminate all of those edges from the shoulder into the forearm, because I created so many edges up here in the shoulder that for the last turntable, I hadn't really figured out how all of those are going to terminate down here. And that's what I'm doing now. And so in the end, since I have to terminate them, I have to terminate them in a way that works with the anatomy. And then also another thing in here just to point out, you want to keep things quads. You also want to ideally only have areas where just 4 faces meet at a vertex. But inevitably, as you extrude faces off of each other, you're going to end up with situations like this, where you have 5 or 6. You just want to keep those to a minimum. And ideally, areas that have 5 or 6 faces meeting at a point are in areas that are going to not be in a big, broad, flat area, because you would see a kink. But if they're in areas like this where you're going to have, as we can see in the design back there, a ridge or something that you can hide that, then you're fine. So 5 meeting is, pretty common. 6 meeting, you at a point you really want to try to avoid, and anything more than 6 is kind of a no-no. You'll just get really funky subdividing in ZBrush and cause problems for sculpting, and just also the way it'll deform in rigging. But it's definitely fine to put stuff like that, in places you can hide, or at the bottom of the foot, back of an ear, stuff like that. All right, so I'm just going to pause this for a second, and let's just sort of really quickly sort of scrub over. You can sort of see as I'm resolving more areas. Here I decided for the forearm that from the front, we don't really know, if we look at the design over here, how this point terminates into the top. And so here I just had to make the call that it terminates up into a little ridge, but the ridge doesn't go all the way up here. It stops right there. Now, if you're the designer, like I am on this project, then it's very easy for you to make these decisions on your own. If it's somebody else's design and you have questions like this, then obviously the thing to do is to ask. If you're unsure about something, there's nothing wrong with asking. If you're working somewhere where you have the opportunity to approach a supervisor, or ideally the designer directly, and just ask what's up. But I would highly recommend to not just assume anything and do something that in the end is a pretty major decision without consulting somebody. So now let's just scrub forward a little bit, just still resolving the termination points. And as we're getting more geometry inside here, it's getting closer and closer to matching the design, but with more vertices. There's lots of vertex by vertex tweaking. All right, so now we're switching to the rear leg again. One of the things, I started with the rear leg, but definitely didn't finish it. And so now I'm moving on to that to move the pivot point for that surface back to that little blue dot. So I can now rotate it because I now need to resolve what the geometry looks like at the back of the rear leg when he bends the leg. So I can now see that when he bends the leg like that, based on the base mesh that I currently have, it's going to intersect the thigh. And since I want him to be able to bend his leg pretty tightly, I need to resolve my base mesh. So this is now getting back into sort of design calls of the shape of that geometry. Now getting these to line up. Now I'm going to need to insert some edges for them to line up better and terminate them somehow. And whenever you have extra edges that you need to terminate, it's always good to look around your model to see if there's an area that could definitely use the extra resolution. So obviously I have this big area here that definitely needs more information, more subdivisions, or more edges in order for better subdivisions later. And therefore I'm choosing to terminate things into the deltoid. And then now let's just sort of cruise through a little bit. See, added an extra edge inside there so I could get that ridge on this sort of claw part of that kickstand. So silly that I'm calling it a kickstand, but it's kind of what it is. So we can see I have a lot of geometry inside here. You know, I've inserted lots of edges just to try and keep things square, just based on the fact that I might end up doing a bit of sculpting in there in ZBrush. I'm just going to scrub forward a little bit. So we can definitely see at this point things are looking nicely resolved in the arm and chest, into the forearm. Now dealing more stuff on the torso. And now moving into the thigh. This is probably a good point for me to mention the fact that while based on the design, it's clear that this creature could be a single mesh, a single surface for the whole thing. But also, based on the design, I made the decision when doing the base mesh that I would have the rear leg and this geometry be separate surfaces. And then I also made the decision that I would really make my life easier if I made this surface separate from the torso, which means that I'm going to have a separation there in the waist that is going to require some sort of accessory like a belt or something like that to cover up that part. Making a decision like that is something obviously that you have to be careful of, but the reason I'm doing it has specifically to do with ZBrush. ZBrush only allows you to subdivide geometry into so many polygons. And so usually a single subtool in ZBrush, you can subdivide up to about 4 million polys on any machine without a problem. Going above 4 million polys depends on how much RAM you have and if you're on a 64-bit machine. Now, if I had this guy as a single mesh, 4 million polys for the whole character is not really going to be enough. Even with an ordered base mesh like this, it's not going to be enough for me to do the amount of detail that I wanted to do on this guy. So now on my machine that I use a 64-bit machine that has 8 gigs of RAM. So ZBrush on that machine allows me to go up to about 12 million polys and have decent performance. I can go higher, but it gets a little sluggish. So now 12 million is a little better for the whole character, but in the end, the more the better. So I figured, well, having the rear leg and this be separate pieces is no big deal because you don't even see the contact point inside there. So I immediately feel might as well have them be separate because then now this rear leg alone can be 12 million polys in ZBrush and I can really sculpt a lot of detail on it. As far as this piece going into the torso and the arms, that was a tougher call as far as whether I wanted to break it. So I had to think a little bit about whether or not that was going to be a kosher thing to do. And I finally decided that the compromise of giving him some sort of belt or something was worth having the extra polys in ZBrush and not having to get into HD sculpting and stuff like that. So again, a case that since this is a project for myself, I can easily make that decision. And since I wanted him to be, like a pet type thing, him having a little belt, maybe with a hook or something that you could connect a chain or something to, actually was appropriate. So I figured that that would be fine. So now going in, just had to add some more edge loops to make things more square in the head. And now resolving the head some more. So again, it seems like, well, I'm really inserting a lot of stuff. It's like, I'm not though. I'm trying to keep things square. And the more I insert, the better my base mesh can match my design. The main thing is trying to keep things as square as I can. The introduction of ZBrush into my workflow, definitely is, causes certain compromises and certain things in how you approach what you do in Maya, which is totally worth it. So I'm just going to pause for a second so we can see how our base mesh is coming. Definitely we can see all the landmarks. We can already notice that just in the base mesh alone, a lot of the main anatomical features are flowing in the correct direction. We can see that deltoid, we can see that. And the nice thing about having this ordered base mesh is once I get into ZBrush, the base mesh alone is so clear, I know exactly where I need to be sculpting when I get into ZBrush. So it gives me a very clear guide to follow. All right, so now let's just sort of scrub forward a little bit, just resolving some stuff in the rear leg. I'm trying to make the front of the leg here a little sharper so that it does have more of the feeling of being something with a sharp front edge, making it just seem a little more aggressive. Now I'm completely changing the flow of the edges on the bottom of the rear leg. We can see if I go back, this is what it looked like based on the original base mesh that I did, but then really looking at the design and seeing the flow of these wrinkles or edges or ridges inside there, I decided to take the time and change the edge flow inside here. So I'm just splitting polygons, splitting across polys, and then deleting edges to then clean it up and resolve the puzzle. So let's just scoot forward a little bit. Starting to do a bit of scrubbing over this. Hopefully you're okay with that, but I think at this point you probably get the idea. It's just more of the same. just resolving, resolving, resolving. So now I'm going in there and putting that finger, simple cube. And then now with that in there, you can see I now have the issue of like, okay, well, the design, we only see one finger. Well, based on the size of the finger, based on what its width should be, based on the forearm opening that I put in there, it would only be able to fit one. So that's an issue. And so now the issue is like, well, does it look cool with one? Or should he have more than one? And so what was going through my head at this point is like, when I saw the one, I know it matches the design, but it doesn't feel as, since my original design document, I said intelligent, and the idea of that was that, well, he has to be able to then maybe do stuff other than just movement, like do stuff with his hands to seem intelligent. There's not much you can do with just one finger on each hand. If you had maybe two on each hand, well, there's a big difference between, two fingers and four between each, between both. And so, or six. So it's just the one finger, while maybe it looks cool, I felt from a animation perspective down the road, it was going to be too limiting. So two. Can do a lot more with those two. So now I need to widen up that opening so that they both fit in there. Now just mirroring it across. And now I'm going to resolve it. Figuring out how deep it needs to go in there. And then inside here, an important thing with your base meshes for fingers, definitely make sure you have more edges at the knuckles. Anywhere you have a joint, like an elbow or a finger knuckle, it just makes your life easier for rigging later. So while I say that things need to be evenly spaced and all that stuff for ZBrush, from a rigging perspective, it's good to have extra vertices or edges at knuckles. It'll just give you a lot more control when you get to rigging. And personally, I find fingers easier to block out as a base mesh in Maya than in ZBrush. But hands and fingers are hard, so maybe that's why. Just pure sculpting of hands and fingers, I think, in ZBrush is problematic. It's nice that in Maya, you can make one finger and copy it and merge them and all that kind of stuff. So here I decided that the tip of the finger would be a nail or a claw. So now I am resolving the contact point between the skin and where the nail claw thing comes out. Making it pointy. Oh boy, tumble mayhem. And then decided it would be cool if it had a little ridge inside of it, as we can see there. And then added that to the finger as well, just so that they can match up. Now at this point, we can see what our finger is looking like. And Just giving a little bit of width to the knuckles. And then duplicating it, scaling it down a little bit. So there's a big one and a small one. At this point, I was much happier with the two. So now I need to get the hole inside there to be deeper so that we just see it go relatively far in there. So I need it to go, far up enough that we can just sort of not see where they terminate. And there you go. All right, so now I'm getting back to overall tweaking. So again, if I got, at that point, I probably, when I was working on this earlier, probably got a little tired of doing it, so decided I'll do the finger. That'll be a little change of pace, and then back to this stuff. So now looking at the top of the head. Oh wait, here's something important. For the head there, decided that that needs to separate. Instead of just being connected, I wanted there to be a little gap between the skull and this sort of top of the jaw face thing. And so creating that. And filling that hole, splitting, and then now we can see what I did inside there. So originally it was just connected, now it's got a nice ridge behind it. It's going to just make it much more dynamic, especially from, it won't really change from the side, but seen from the top or the front, it'll make a big difference. All right, so let's skip through some of this. I'm just going to be resolving the top of the head a little bit, the jaw, the general flow, adding another extra ridge there to tighten up that detail based on the design. And so now you can see it's starting to flow here, like we have back there. Just tweaking. Just a lot of vertex by vertex scooting around. Now, this thing back here, the back of the head, I decided the topology there wasn't working, so I'm going to handle that a little bit differently now by extruding some faces. So now it's just going to match a lot better. And then just refine that form a little bit. And then give it a little more volume. All right, and so now you can see what we just did there, just to match that. Definitely looks a lot cooler. Okay, just resolving shape of the back of the neck. So as you can see, this is a pretty anal process, but I'm a very patient anal person, so for me, it's okay. All right, now we're getting into the next thing, which is cleanup. I'm basically almost done with the base mesh. And so the cleanup phase, basically, I just want to make sure there aren't any areas where I forgot to terminate an edge. And so the easiest thing to do is to select the geometry and go under Edit Mesh Cleanup and ask for it to select or highlight any faces with more than 4 sides. And so under cleanup options, instead of cleaning, I don't want it to clean it up for me. I want to clean it up. So I just say select. So it's not going to actually do anything other than select faces with more than 4 sides. So when I hit go, we can see inside here that it highlighted these faces. So even though we look at it and it looks like they're 4-sided, which is why it's easy to miss, you have to be really, really careful because you'll look at it and you'll think like, oh, it looks fine. But there's probably 2 vertices on top of each other here that I didn't merge. And that kind of stuff, if you send that to ZBrush and start sculpting and don't notice it, and then all of a sudden you're like halfway through your sculpt and you realize that, it's a big pain in the butt to deal with. And so I always am very anal about cleaning up my model and making sure it's 100% ready to go to ZBrush and doesn't have any of these kind of problems. So now I'm just looking for the faces that were highlighted by the cleanup tool and fixing those problems. So I can see here I had 2 vertices that were not welded, they weren't merged. So fixing that. Now selecting the next piece, just looking to see if it highlighted something. I can see where it did. So you can see there I had something that I didn't terminate. And then the decision of where to have it go. And then here you can see instead of figuring out where to terminate that thing, I decided to change my mind and work on something else, which is change the flow in the pelvis. Figuring first I should figure that flow out because it was very off from the design, and then I could figure out the other thing. So that things work better. Extrude that in to make that little pocket. All right, let's just go forward a little bit. It's going to be more cleanup on the pelvis. Now cleaning up into the leg a little bit. Just working out the flow. All right, so at this point, let's see, looks like I finished on the thigh, then moved on to clean up the rear leg. And so the rear leg, it selected a face inside there, which I just cleaned up. And now duplicating. More cleanup. Add some extra faces. You always have to be careful when you extrude faces that are along the 0 axis, because then they're going to create interior faces that you need to remove. Getting that to fit into that pocket a little bit better. And so at this point we can see that our base mesh is looking pretty cool for a base mesh, as far as definitely not nearly as cool as it needs to look in the end, but good enough. It is definitely matching our design. One more thing to clean up. Add an extra vert. Now I'm taking a final pass to look for areas that I can make things more square. So inserting some edges, final cleanup. right, just grouping things. And I'm going to do another turntable because at this point I'm pretty sure that my base mesh is probably as done as it needs to be. So just one more turntable. So we can see it was design 16 rev 1, model 14. And so there's that guy. And render it out. And this one I chose to render faceted instead of rendering it with the wireframe. Just figured that was good enough. And there we go. And so let me go and find that movie real quick. So that's going to be my projects, kickstand, movies, and there it is. Here we go. All right, so that is our final base mesh. Let me make this a little bigger. So normal size. All right. So I feel exhausted watching all of that time-lapse footage. I hope that that was not too unbearable to watch. I think I just wanted you to see everything, and you just did. So that is literally everything that went into making the base mesh. So again, it was probably, I'd say somewhere about 7 hours or 6 hours or something that I spent on the base mesh. I don't know, maybe it was 8, but it was definitely something that I view work days as being 12 hours. And so it's definitely not a full day. And and it's time that would need to be spent later. And so the fact that my base mesh, has all of the important detailed information from the design is just going to make my life a lot easier later on in ZBrush and for rigging, because this is definitely a completely riggable model. All right, so with the model basically done, let's get back to our video. Of course, I'm anal, so I'm doing one more pass through. Decided to just resolve the silhouette in a few more areas. Resolve the neck a little bit more. Once you know you're almost done, it gets very tempting to just really just tune if you have the time, which in this case, felt I had the time, whether I did or not. All right, refining this area. So here you've got your neck muscle, and then you've got a tendon that comes out there as well. And this is an area that, since you have things, if you have a normal box modeled neck and head, and the flow is just completely just going, like I said earlier, with the profile, it always is really hard to sculpt this area, without, even if you subdivide high in ZBrush, you still get all of the all of this faceting. So I find that this is a pretty critical area to have your topology work for you. And definitely makes a big difference with rigging to have that be correct. And then since I, inserted an edge in there, I just needed to go around to all the verts and make sure that they're flowing correctly. So we can see inside here, neck muscle, and this pretty strong tendon, which on this guy you can see in the design even is really, really strong. So much stronger than a regular human. There it is. And then just use the cleanup tool, saw that I had a couple things I needed to tweak. And then tumbling, because I'm looking at it from a billion angles. All right, now I'm getting ready to mirror and merge. So I'm just going down the center line and making sure all the verts are grid snapped. Being pretty anal about that. And then mirror copying. And then once I've mirrored, I can select the two copies, merge them, or rather combine them into one mesh, and then merge the vertices down the middle. And then there you go. All right. Now down here, I had that open edge at the bottom of the torso. I'm choosing to select that edge and extrude it in. This is a ZBrush thing. Trying to sculpt on that edge there. If it's just an open edge, ZBrush doesn't like that at all, and you get really weird behavior. So since I know that I may end up needing to sculpt along that edge, I choose to give some thickness inside there. It just makes life easier. And then do it there as well. All right. So now going into Photoshop, I'm deciding to check where that belt should be, because I already in Maya kind of made the decision of where it would be, but in Photoshop I'm just going in and confirming that that's an okay place for a little belt with a little chain for our alien pet. And now I'm going to model the belt. And deciding to find the right way that I want to do it, and being lazy and doing it that way. And then once I have it with a general shape, I'm just going to select all those faces and extrude them to give it thickness at some point. There we go. And then now, as I was looking at it from different angles, I noticed that from the back it looks okay, but from the front it seemed like it was hanging too high, so I'm lowering it down. And then realizing it still looks a little high from the front, like it should hang lower. So add in some edges, and now just getting that to be a little lower down so it looks a little better from the front. And now I realized that I did have to lower it a bit more, and now I've lowered it where the top edge of the belt is actually where that seam line is. So I'm going to have to reposition the seam between the two surfaces. And then now that's better because now the belt is hiding the seam. Duplicate, combine, merge, give it thickness, do the same thing there. And there you go. And then some final tweaks on the belt. And at this point, we have reached the end of modeling the base mesh, I believe. Yep, save it out. Yeah, that took us to the end. Let's jump back there. There we go. So we made it to the base mesh being done. And at this point, before we can go to ZBrush, have to lay out the UVs for it. One more thing to do, puzzle-based, little tedious, has to be done. I can do the UVs later, but it's one of those things. I wouldn't do the UV. If this was a simple base mesh, I was going to go to ZBrush and sculpt and retopologize. I wouldn't need to do the UVs because if I have to retopologize later, I'm going to have to redo the UVs. But since this is our final mesh, might as well UV it now. And so that is going to be the next step. And so for the UVs, those are something that I tend to do using a program called UV Layout, not Maya. UV Layout is a relatively inexpensive program. You can get it at Hedus, HEADUS.AU. It's made by a guy named Phil Dench. It's rad. It's cheap. It's like $200, and it's amazing for laying out UVs. And that's what I'm going to use for this guy.